Well, it is 7:30, so it's time to get this thing started. Hope you guys are ready for all of this. Few people online right now, and now here I am. Hello, everybody. It is time for our time period 3 AP exam review. We're going to be covering 1754 to 1787 to 1800 tonight. If you have any questions, go ahead and plop them in the chat and we'll get those answered as quickly as I can. Now, if you're sitting there and you see a message come through on the chat that you can answer, feel free to hop in and help out with that as well. But we got a lot to cover tonight. If you've done any reviews with me before, you know that I do the big ideas, and I have 10 big ideas that we need to cover. So if you guys are ready, I'm ready. So let's go ahead and get this review started. So go over here to this magic screen, and I have to readjust it, but that's okay. So big idea number 1. Let me go back actually to one screen real quick. Let me go back here because I do want to give us our focus for tonight. As I said, we're going 1754 to 1800. And the big events during this time period obviously are the American Revolution, the challenges that we're going to face as a new country, specifically how do we create a new government. And we're also going to see the very first two-party system evolve into our nation's politics. The big names, you know them all already. You know, Washington, Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson. I mean, there's a bunch more, but these are the names that if you walk away tonight and you know who these guys are and what they contributed to this time period, you're doing pretty darn good. All right, so let's get to the first big idea. I went backwards 3 times. Here we go. Big idea number 1. The French and the Indian War is going to lead to an increased land for the American colonies, but it's also going to lead to a greater burden of taxation. So let's talk briefly about this French-Indian War. Essentially, the causes of this war were land. You had England and France who were essentially trying to colonize the entire world. And here in North America, they both coveted the Ohio River Valley. So when we start talking about the specific causes of this war, you got to think about the Ohio River Valley and what it offered to both nations. You also had France dealing with the fact that English colonists are starting to move into that territory. It's territory that they had claimed as their own, but English colonists are starting to go in there, and some of those colonists are messing with the trade relationships that they have with the Native Americans in the region. And then, just an overview, like I said, England and France are at war throughout the entire world, and that war is going to spill over into North America. Because you have the English colonies over here, you also have New France over here, so this is going to be a battleground as well. But if I had to pick one major event or one major cause of the French-Indian War, it's going to be for control of the Ohio River Valley. Now, when this war first started, England is looking to the colonies for help. And Benjamin Franklin is going to call for a conference in Albany, New York. And there he's going to present the Albany Plan of Union. If you know what I'm talking about, he's going to draw a political cartoon that shows different parts of the snake. And the theme of the cartoon is join or die. He wants all the colonies to join together in order to build essentially a continental army and then help fight the Native Americans and the French along the western frontier. This is supposed to help the English as well. Unfortunately, though, the colonies all rejected this plan because part of the Albany Plan of Union included each colony contributing tax dollars to this venture, and none of them wanted to give up their tax dollars. So because of that, because of the taxation, all the colonies rejected the Albany Plan of Union. But why it's so important is because it's going to set a precedent for establishing our future colonial congresses like the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress. And it's also going to kind of lay the groundwork for the unification of the colonies as we go into the American Revolution. So though it failed, it was still very important in laying groundwork for what's going to happen, 25 years in the future. Now, the war is going to be fought. We don't need to get into the details of the war, and Great Britain and the English are going to win this war. war, alongside all the colonists who were fighting with them. With the Treaty of Paris of 1763, sometimes called the Peace of Paris of 1763, France essentially leaves North America. The Louisiana Territory is going to go to Spain, and England essentially doubles her territory in North America. Now, the colonists who had fought alongside the English during this war assumed that they too were going to benefit from the spoils of war, that all this new land was going to be available for them to move out west. As I said, the Ohio River Valley was coveted by everyone, including the colonists. So you're going to start seeing colonists flooding into the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, this is going to cause a problem for the Native Americans who live in that region, because up to this point, they had been allied with the French. And now that the French are gone, they really have no friends. And now they see all these English colonists coming their way, and they're like, oh my gosh. And so Detroit Native American by the name of Pontiac, he is going to arrange a alliance, if you will, of Native Americans, and they're going to launch Pontiac's Rebellion. This is the Ottawa Nation that is doing that. England is able to suppress that rebellion, but they also recognize, because of Pontiac's rebellion, that they don't have the logistical power, whether it's economic power or military power, to defend the entire new territory that they gained from France. And they definitely can't protect the colonists if they move west. So as a result of Pontiac's rebellion, in the peace negotiated with the Ottawa Nation, England promises to keep the colonies or the colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains. They passed the Proclamation Act of 1763, which in essence drew a geographical boundary along the edge of the Appalachian Mountains and told the colonists, you cannot cross this boundary, and told the Native Americans, this land on the western side of this mountain range is reserved for you. And the idea was this is going to limit the hostilities between the Native Americans and the colonists, and it's also going to slow down the settlement of the West until England can get a better foothold and can actually protect it better. Colonists weren't too happy about this. They felt like they fought in the war. They earned this right to have this land. But as I said in class, it's not going to affect a vast majority of colonists. So though some were angry about this and some felt controlled by this, it doesn't really have a lasting anger effect throughout the colonies. That's not going to come until about 1763 and 1765, because it's there that we start talking about this greater burden of taxation. So let's get to big idea number 2, which says that British colonial policies, specifically the taxation without colonial representation in Parliament, is going to lead to the Revolutionary War. It's in this idea that we are going to take steps and we're going to get on this road to the American Revolution. Now, England dealt with the problem of the West. They dealt with the colonists trying to expand into Native American lands. Now they got to deal with the other problem that came out of the French and Indian War, and that's the debt. England is in they saw their debt double during this war, so they need to get it taken care of. So when you're talking about causes of the taxation policy, it's directly tied to the French Indian War and the cost of that war. So what England's going to do is they're going to start enacting these revenue-producing taxes that's going to help pay for the war and honestly help maintain a military presence in the colonial regions of North America. The very first thing you're going to realize is when England starts enacting all these taxes, what they're actually doing is they're bringing an end to salutary neglect. If you remember correctly from time period 2, England was pretty much letting the colonies live and let live, doing their own thing, running their own governments, just being, because they were making quite a bit of money through mercantilism. Well, now England owes quite a bit of money. So they're going to pull back the reins on the colonies and say, okay, now you got to do it our way. Now we've got to start hunkering down and dealing with things as an empire, not just as 13 individual colonies. And the other thing they're going to do is they're going to start reinforcing the Navigation Acts. These are laws laws that were already in place. They just never enforced them. So we're going to see new taxes introduced. We're going to see old laws being enforced. And then we're going to even start seeing England doing things in the colonies that you normally don't see during peacetime. I mentioned that they're trying to maintain a level of a military presence in the colonies during this time. That is really uncommon during peacetime. Normally during peacetime, nations would reduce the amount of their soldiers, but it seemed like in the colonies, they were increasing the number of soldiers in the region. And that's going to lead to the First Quartering Act. And the colonists, it's not like Great Britain's going to come in and build all these barracks and these apartment complexes for the soldiers. They're like, no, we got colonists living there. So what they're going to do is they're going to require the colonists to start giving a home to these soldiers. And not only just give them a home, but feed them and take care of their stuff and do their laundry, all that stuff. And so that's the first sign that things are starting to change. And then we start seeing the taxes come in. Now, most of these taxes are on imported luxury goods, but it does start to affect the colonies the more that are introduced. Now, the first big one is the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was a tax on all imported tea, and as I mentioned in class, the Sugar Act was actually an extension or a renewing of a previous English tax called the Molasses Act. And all they did was they just said, well, we've been charging tax for molasses up to this point. Let's just continue that. And so that's going to be the Sugar Act of 1764. Again, not a major effect because it only affected those who were importing sugar, and most of the colonists didn't really feel the weight of that cost because it was negligible. The next one, though, the big one that you should know, is the Stamp Act of 1765. This is going to be a tax on all paper products throughout the colonies. This was a direct tax, where the sugar tax was a tax on imports, so the merchants paid it, and then they kind of passed that cost on to their consumers. The Stamp Act is a direct tax that the colonists are paying. So anything they do with paper, they're actually having to pay a tax for that paper. And then when they paid that tax, the paper would be stamped as, quote, tax paid. This is where the colonists start getting a little bit grumpy with Great Britain. And this is where we hear for the very first time, no taxation without representation. Because the colonists are like, we've been living under colonial governing control for years, for like all this century. And our local colonial governments have been taxing us, but England hasn't. And so we think that because we have a government here, that's the authority that has the power to tax us, because we are represented in our local governments. We are not represented in the English government. We do not have representatives in Parliament. So because of that, we believe that we are being taxed without being represented. Parliament's argument, you are absolutely being represented because we are representing you virtually. It's called virtual representation. And the idea behind it is that everyone who was serving in Parliament took an oath to basically work for every single English citizen throughout the entire empire, which would include the colonies. This is going to cause a lot of pushback from the colonies because they're not buying it. They don't think that England has their best intentions in mind. They think that England essentially is trying to reach in their back pocket to get all their money so they can pay off their debt. And they feel isolated because, quite honestly, the Stamp Act just occurred in the North American colonies. So this is when you're going to see the colonists start to protest in a number of different ways. They're going to organize like intercolonial committees to start conversing with one another to discuss what they're dealing with in their colony. They're going to start boycotting British goods. They're going to start destroying British property. They're going to start attacking British officials. All of this in response to the Stamp Act. We're going to see several organizations rise up. You're going to see the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, and they are essentially the crux behind this entire movement. They're the ones that are pushing this because they see the English almost as, like I said, taking advantage of these, little colonies over across the ocean, and there's nothing that we can possibly do about it. And the Sons of Liberty said, well, watch us. We have some responses. We have a little chutzpah. We can take you on. And so that's when you're going to start seeing things like the tarring and feathering of the tax collectors and stuff like that. The Stamp Act Congress is going to meet. They're going to have about 27 delegates from 9 different colonies. And what they're going to do is they're going to send a petition to England to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, be careful. The Stamp Act Congress is not talking about independence at all. They're not talking about us breaking away from England. They're just saying we want full rights as English citizens. You said Parliament is representing all English citizens, which means that you're representing us. We're citizens of the English Empire. We want all the same rights that every single other English citizen gets throughout the entire empire, especially those who live in London. So that's kind of what the Stamp Act Congress, when they sent this petition to Parliament, that's essentially what they were asking for. And what's going to end up happening, and you can say it's due to the petition, you can say it's due to the boycotts, you could say it's due to the protests, but Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. It goes away. But just to kind of dig in a little bit on the colonists, they're going to pass the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act basically said we can pass any law we want at any time for whatever reason we think is important, and that includes taxes. So just because we're not taxing now doesn't mean we won't tax later. And guess what? In 1767, they sent another round of taxes over. It's called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were a tax on 5 different products: lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. And these are more taxes that are more direct taxes, but again, not as direct as the Stamp Act, but still kind of ticked them off. So guess what they did? Sons of Liberty come back. They start boycotting again. The Daughters of Liberty start making homespun fabric and creating all their goods themselves, so they don't have to rely on British-made goods. And guess what happens? Parliament repeals the Townshend Act. They repeal everything but the tea tax. Now, so this is 1774, I'm getting my dates mixed up. 1767. And so they repeal the Townshend Act. They leave the tea tax on there. I want to point that out because the tea tax remains for the next 7 years. So just put that in the back of your mind. Everything seems quiet for a while, but then we're going to have a dust up in 1770 in Boston. I told you that the number of soldiers that were staying in the colonies was starting to grow, and the colonists are not happy that soldiers are there because they say soldiers should only be where there is war, and there's no war here. But of course, the colonists and the Sons of Liberty were attacking tax collectors and stuff like that. So England said, let's send over a few more soldiers and let's quarter them in the colonial houses and stuff. And then you can feel the tension rising in Boston. And that's going to result in the Boston Massacre in 1770. Essentially, a crowd of angry Bostonians are going to confront a squad of British soldiers. And one thing leads to another, shots ring out, and 5 Boston citizens are killed. The soldiers are going to go on trial, defended by John Adams, and they're going to be found not guilty. And it almost seemed like things quieted down after that. It was almost like the tension built up, then exploded, and then everybody just said, oh, we got to take a step back. It's getting a little bit out of hand. And we don't hear anything until about 1773. And in 1773, Parliament sees an opportunity to raise their own personal funds. You had the Dutch East India Trading Company, which many members of Parliament owned stock in. And the East India Trading Company was, part of this trade network, and one of their products was this very high quality tea. And the members of Parliament who had stock in this tea company, I imagine they sat there and said, we have those 13 colonies over there. Why don't we pass a law where the only tea they could buy is from our company? And it's good quality tea, and we can sell it rather inexpensively, so it's going to benefit our colonies. It's going to benefit, the Dutch East India Trading Company, which means it's going to benefit us as stockholders. So in 1773, they passed the Tea Act. And the Tea Act essentially set up a monopoly for the sale of tea in the colonies, and you could only purchase tea from the Dutch East India Trading Company. Well, the colonists didn't like that because, as I've said before, why buy high-quality, cheap tea when you can buy expensive, crappy tea? So the colonists are going to revolt, and the Sons of Liberty are going to come back, and what they're essentially going to do is they're going to go, and when these ships come in from the Dutch East India Trading Company, they're going to board those ships at night, and they're going to dump all that high-quality tea into Boston Harbor. Well, now they've done it because the owners of the Dutch East India Trading Company, i.e. Parliament, is pretty peeved because they just lost all that money. So they demand that someone pay their losses. And no one's stepping up to pay for that. So the next step that Parliament takes is more of a punishment for Boston for the actions of the Sons of Liberty, and they passed the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts are also known as the Intolerable Acts. These are interchangeable, so you might see one or the other on different exams. Just know they're the exact same thing. There were key components to the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act, they shut down the Boston port until the tea was paid for. Well, that's not going to happen. So the port stays closed, which means all colonial trading comes to an end. They add another quartering act and send over more soldiers. They're going to shut down all Massachusetts forms of self-government. They're going to put the Quebec Act in there, and the Quebec Act basically has nothing to do with Boston, but what they did was they opened up all the lands in the Ohio River Valley to the Canadians, to the Frenchmen, to the people we beat in the French-Indian War. So I guess you can kind of imagine how the colonists are feeling at this point. And word gets out because we have those committees of correspondence, and word gets out at what happened in Boston, and this feeling kind of starts to spread. Well, if it can happen in Boston, it can happen here. And so as a result of the Intolerable Acts, you are going to see the First Continental Congress come together. And the First Continental Congress comes together in 1774, and what they essentially do is they're going to send a Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the king. Again, guys, this is not the Declaration of Independence. This is a declaration listing their rights that they believe they have as English citizens and their grievances, their complaints about the mistreatment of the colonies by Parliament. So they're going to send that off, hoping that this is going to kind of calm things down between England and the 13 colonies. But what they do is, in the meantime, while they're waiting to hear from England, they advise all the colonies to start putting their militias together. They said, just go ahead and bring your militias back together and make sure that they have supplies and make sure they have their weapons and stuff like that, just in case. And this is going to basically be one of the last steps, or the last step, before we actually see the war and battles starting. Now, what I would recommend, guys, if you want to do a quick review, and I gave this to you in class, but if you just want to draft out just a timeline from 1763 to 1774 of the different events that happened along the way that kind of culminated in the First Continental Congress coming together. So you have an idea in your mind of the cause and effect. This happened, and because this happened, then this happened. And because the Stamp Act was passed and the Sons of Liberty were organized. And then the Sons of Liberty are going to lead boycotts, and because of the boycotts, the Stamp Act's going to be repealed, but the Declaratory Act's going to be passed. And just create your own little timeline on a scratch piece of paper and see if you can walk yourself through the story of the road to the American Revolution. But where I'm going to take you now is to big idea number 3. And big idea number 3 says that Enlightenment ideals exhibited a major influence on the American independence movement. That was especially exhibited in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. Now listen, we got the colonial militias arming and getting ready to go. And you got to start thinking, what are these colonists? What is this colonial Congress? What are they thinking? Well, they're thinking about what they learned during the Enlightenment period, what they learned during the First Great Awakening, and how that all leads to this idea of independence. And so they're going to start putting stuff together, the ideas of natural rights and the social contract and Rousseau's separation of powers and this and that. And then they start thinking about the First Great Awakening and the effect of, the movement of I'm drawing a blank here, of the speeches of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield about being able to decide for yourself what you want your faith to be and decide for yourself what you want your relationship with Jesus to be. And all of this comes together, and you see this desire for independence starting to grow for the patriots throughout the colonies. Now, keep in mind, though, that they're looking at this. They're still not 100% sure they want to break free from England. I mean, really, they're still part of the greatest empire in the world, but they do see the British has been, as they see it, violating their natural rights, violating the social contract that they share with the government. And so we're going to see another Continental Congress come together. What's going to happen in between is the first battle of the American Revolution, and that's in 1775 in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. When that happens, when you have the Battle of Lexington and Concord happen, the Second Continental Congress is going to come together and say, okay, the British are now taking up arms against us. Yeah, we were arming our militia, but they marched on us. So now we're going to have to start taking more drastic actions, taking more drastic measures. So in 1775, 1776, the Second Continental Congress are going to come together. As they're coming together, Thomas Paine, who I like to refer to as like a professional revolutionary, he never saw a revolution he didn't think was awesome, but he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. And in Common Sense, he's going to reference the Bible, he's going to reference Enlightenment ideas, and he's going to bring those together and basically lay out an explanation of why the colonies should break free from England, why they should declare their independence. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress is meeting. They're going to take one last-ditch effort for peace. They're going to send the olive branch petition to the king asking, hey, can we just go back to the way things were? They're going to get a flat-out no from the king. They're going to, draft what is known as the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, when you look at it and you break it down, it is full of Enlightenment ideals. Written by Thomas Jefferson along with a team of 4 other men that included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. They are going to introduce the colonies to their inalienable rights. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A takeoff of John Locke's natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And they are going to say that we are, entitled through our Creator to these inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the king isn't living up to that. And then they list out all their grievances of why they are going to declare independence from Great Britain. And once that declaration was ratified, once all the colonies approved it, we're off and running. And we're on our way to, getting into the meat of the American Revolution, which also takes us to big idea number 4. The American Revolution, we know on paper Britain should have won. Despite their military and their financial advantages, our patriots won the American Revolution and gained independence. Now, we had different people in society who weren't 100% behind this war. You had the patriots who were pro-independence, but you also had a lot of loyalists who were living in the colonies at this point. They didn't want to separate from England. They wanted to stay with the mother country. And then, quite honestly, you had about 40% of the population who could care less. This was your rural population, and they were so far removed from the fighting and so far removed from the protests and all this other stuff. They're like, oh, whatever. I gotta go dig up potatoes. Just do what you're gonna do. It's thought that, some people say it was a third for each group, but I think there was more who just didn't care, who just said, I want to live my life. But we're in a war. And the king declared war, actually, against us when he put out his proclamation regarding the colonies being in revolt. And that's essentially was the declaration of war. And so what we're going to see happen is we got to put together a Continental Army. We got all these 13 militias, but we need to bring them together. We need to get them organized under this banner of a Continental Army. And in comes George Washington. George Washington is going to be the commander of our Continental Army, and he is going to have to deal with an army that has no training, that has no money, and has very few to no supplies. piece of cake, right? I mean, we're only going up against the greatest empire in the world, and we got nothing. But you know what he did was he did it. He got it done. I mean, it was hard at first. There were a lot of early losses for the colonial army. But when we fought in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, well, let me back up a little bit. We had a couple little victories that really gave us hope. For instance, early 1777, end of December 25th, 1776, is when Washington marched his troops into Trenton and surprised the Hessian battalion there and captured the Hessian. And then he went on to win the battle at Princeton the next day. So we had a couple early victories, but the major victory that we had was in 1777 at Saratoga. When we won the Battle of Saratoga, what we're going to see is this is going to be a major turning point for this war. Benjamin Franklin had been over in France trying to convince the French to ally with us, but they were very hesitant. I mean, they already had to leave North America with their tail between their legs following the French and Indian War. And do they really want to get involved in another war over here? But with the victory at Saratoga, what we're going to see is Franklin and others are going to be able to convince France to join the war, and France is going to bring Spain with them. Now, what's great about France and Spain joining the American Revolution, France is going to bring us a lot of military and economic support. They're going to send over a number of generals and people to help train our soldiers. Spain is going to give us a lot of money to help, to get supplies and stuff like that and keep our army going. And a couple names if you want to know for the French, the Marquis de Lafayette, Rochambeau, de Grasse, Baron von Steuben was a German general who came over to help us. So we have help now, and that's going to start turning the war around. The war is going to be fought. The final battle is going to be fought in like 1779 or 1781. It's going to be the Battle of Yorktown. And that's going to be the final battle of the war when General Cornwallis is going to surrender to George Washington. I mean, there were other battles throughout, but really the important thing you need to know is about the Battle of Saratoga, the help we got from foreign nations, and how that turned the war around for us, where we were actually able to gain victory in this war. One thing you might want to note is this did not go unseen in the world. People were watching this war and watching these 13 little pesky colonies rise up against this huge empire. And our American Revolution is actually going to inspire revolutions throughout the world, including in France, including in Haiti. And so we're going to have an effect on the world, going forward because of what we did in the American Revolution. Big idea number 5. Big one here. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution of the United States of America. Failed largely because the federal government was just too weak. Now, during the American Revolution, we had to put a government together. And in 1777, that's exactly what we did. We formed the Articles of Confederation. And when we built this government, we wanted to do everything opposite of what we were fighting against. We believed that Britain had acted in tyranny against us. We believed that Britain had abused its power. And so we're going to make a government that does not have a strong central government that can do the exact same thing. We want a weak central government, and then we want to give all the states the power. And that's exactly what the Articles of Confederation did. Now, it did some good things. Let's be honest. I mean, we won the war under the Articles of Confederation. Another major, check mark in the positive section is going to be the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, combined with the Land Ordinance of 1785, actually established a system for our country to admit new states to the Union. And it also set a precedent because in the Northwest Territory, the area that just surrounds, if you look at a map, and I have a map here, so it would be a map over here for you, I don't know. It surrounds the Great Lakes. So that region, they outlawed slavery right away. So the debate about slavery is already happening. So the Northwest Ordinance not only outlawed slavery, not only set up a guidance for bringing in states, but it showed that we were able to get some things accomplished under this new government. But like I said, it was just not strong enough to sustain our nation. It was a unicameral legislature, so just a one-house legislature, a Congress essentially. We had no executive branch, we had no judicial branch, and every state just had one vote. Now, if they wanted to pass laws, you needed 9 of the 13 states to approve that. If you wanted to amend or change the Articles of Confederation, change that Constitution, you needed all 13 states to agree, which is next to impossible. So this government, while it got us through, it's not going to get us ahead. That's the bottom line. What was the line drawn where slavery was still legal in the South? Well, at this point, Juliana, slavery is legal is legal in all 13 states at this point. The Northwest Ordinance is going to shut it off, and you're going to look at a map, you're looking the southern parts of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. You're also going to see a line that we haven't talked about in class, but it's going to be called the Mason-Dixon line, and that's going to be a division as well, because one thing that we're going to see, which we'll talk more about in our next unit, although it happens in this unit, following the American Revolution, you're going to see, I want to say 8 or 9 of the 13 states are going to start outlawing slavery. And they're going to do it, in different ways. But you're going to start seeing laws on the books of every state pretty rapidly outlawing the use of slavery in their state. So is there a line? There's not an official line, if you will, but a lot of times, and I'll show it to you on a map, but for this test, you don't have to know about it, but it's normally considered the Mason-Dixon line, which is just north of the northern border of Maryland. No worries. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to answer your questions. Come on, and I appreciate them. Let's talk more about this Articles of Confederation. Like I said, 2 weeks to get things done. And what really showed us this was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is going to happen in western Massachusetts, where the state of Massachusetts is going to start implementing property taxes on all its residents because they're trying to pay off their debts from the war. And we talked about it when we did the Madison case study. Inflation is running rampant throughout the country, and Massachusetts is going to try to deal with it by raising taxes. The farmers don't have the money to pay the taxes. And because of that, the state government is starting to foreclose on their homes. So what we do in our nation at this point is when taxes are threatening us, we rebel against those taxes. And that's exactly what Shays' Rebellion was. Daniel Shays is going to lead thousands of farmers against the Massachusetts state government, attempting to close down the courts so they couldn't issue any more foreclosures. Well, when this rebellion started, there was no army or anything that could put the rebellion down. Even though the Articles of Confederation gave our government the power to raise an army, it didn't have the power to tax. So there was no way that they could pay for the army. Because what the plan was to fund our nation was we were just going to get essentially donations from the states. And people don't want to give up their money. You go all the way back to the Albany Plan of Union. It failed because the colonies didn't want to give up their tax dollars. The Articles of Confederation are going to fail for one reason, because the states don't want to give up their tax dollars. So Shays' Rebellion put a spotlight on the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. And so Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and others are going to come together and say, we need to fix the Articles of Confederation. And so that's going to lead us to not big idea number 4, but big idea number 6, the Constitutional Convention. They were called together to create they were called together to fix the Articles of Confederation. And once they realized they can't fix them, they drafted a new constitution that's going to rectify all the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So let's just recap real quick the weaknesses, what the Articles of Confederation could not do. Number 1, they could not tax. They didn't have the power to tax. Number 2, they couldn't keep an army because they couldn't pay for an army. Number 3, they couldn't regulate commerce. The states were actually starting to set up their own trade agreements with foreign countries. The states were starting to issue tariffs on one another to stop interstate trade. And the federal government had no power to regulate any of that commerce whatsoever. There was no executive branch to enforce any of the laws. There was no judicial branch to deal with conflicts between the states. We needed a new constitution. We had to start over. And that was the whole purpose of the Constitutional Convention. And really that's the whole point of big idea number 6. It's just to say, okay, guys, we are coming together. We are going to create a new constitution. And that's exactly what they did. They created a new constitution that was going to be a bicameral legislature. Let me get to that. Let me jump over here to big idea number 7. Big idea number 7 said the Constitution of the United States created a new central government defined by federalism and the separation of powers. So you have all the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They're going to come together and you're going to see drafts of ideas for the Constitution, what the structure of our government is going to look like. The 2 main plans are going to be the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And the debate on the table is how many houses should we have in our legislature and how should people be represented? The bottom line is the Great Compromise is going to be drafted, and the Great Compromise is going to be the meat of our new government, of our new Constitution. And essentially it created a bicameral legislature, meaning a 2-house legislature. You have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. The next big question is, how are people going to be represented? The Virginia plan wanted representation by population, which would favor the big states. The New Jersey plan wanted equal representation, which would favor the small states. What they did was combine the 2 of them. They said the House of Representatives representation will be based on population. That's going to benefit the big states. But see, they also set it up with, you want a law passed through Congress, it has to be approved by both the House and the Senate. So the House, representation based on population, large states have the advantage. More votes, more power. But the Senate is going to be set up with equal representation. Every single state will have 2 senators. Well, there were more small states than there were large states. So the large states, they could work together in the House and get a bill passed to turn into a law. But it had to go to the Senate. And if the small states didn't like it, the Senate could outvote it and overturn that law, and then it's not going to get passed. So they had to find a way to work together. So the Great Compromise, that's huge. Another major compromise during this time is, what do we do about the slaves? Most states had slaves at this point, but obviously the largest population of slaves were in the southern states, specifically Virginia and South Carolina. So they wanted their slaves to count towards population. And we know what they're trying to do here. They're trying to get more voices in government. They're trying to get more power in the House of Representatives. Had nothing to do with the slaves themselves. It's not like the slaves are all of a sudden going to get to be part of the government or be part of society. They're just numbers. Well, the compromise that was made was 3/5 of the slaves were going to count towards representation. Some people said that 3/5 of a person is how they counted it. Some people say 3/5 of the population. The numbers come out the same. So the Great Compromise created our legislature, a 2-house, a bicameral legislature based on representation and equal representation. The 3/5 compromise is going to allow 3/5 of the slaves in our nation in each state to count towards that representation. The other thing they're going to create within the Constitutional Convention is 2 more branches, the executive branch and the judicial branch. So now we have a 3-branch government, and you're going to see the development of the separation of powers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea from the Enlightenment. We need to separate powers so no one has all the power, because if they have that, it can turn into a tyranny. And so that's what we saw happen during the Constitutional Convention. You also saw them set up not only different branches, but checks and balances, checks that each branch had on the other to make sure one branch doesn't get too powerful. So Congress can pass laws, but the president can veto those laws. Congress can override those vetoes with a 2/3 majority vote. The president can nominate judges to the Supreme Court, but they have to be approved by the Senate, and the Senate can reject those. The Supreme Court, we're going to find, and this, it didn't happen right away, but the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review to determine whether or not laws are constitutional. Should they determine laws unconstitutional, Congress can rewrite those laws and then send them to the president, who can then approve those laws. So there's all these checks going back and forth on each of these branches, so no one gets too much power. And that was the goal through all of this. The result of all this, federalism, the division between state power and federal power. Okay, so that federalism is very, very important too. There was no desire to take all of the power away from the states. And so when you look at the U.S. Constitution, and I'm trying to remember if I'm going to talk specifically about the Bill of Rights. Let me check my notes. I'm cheating, I know. Yeah, I'm not. Okay, so the Bill of Rights is going to be added, the first 10 amendments, and that's when the individual rights get built into the Constitution. But the 10th Amendment very clearly states that anything not listed in the actual Constitution becomes the power of a state, and that's how the states get their power under federalism. And what you need to realize, guys, is the Constitution, what these men put together, were the rules that our government has to operate under. If you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, that deals with the legislative branch. Article 1, Section 8, read it sometimes. It lists out everything Congress can and can't do. It lines out their powers. Article 2 of the Constitution is the executive branch. Same thing. It lists out what the powers of the president are. And then finally, Article 3 deals with the judicial branch and lists out their powers. Although what it lists in the Constitution for the judicial branch, very narrow. There's hardly anything there, because I don't think they really knew what they wanted to do with the judicial branch in the beginning. They knew they needed it. They just didn't know how much they needed it. So they'll figure that out in our next unit. So the result of all of this is we have a stronger central government that's going to be able to operate and sustain our nation. Okay? All right, moving on to big idea number... Did I skip one? I went from no. Big idea number 8. I'm like, we're going through these a lot faster than I expected to. All right. Let me flip my page here. Big idea number 8. And I kind of already mentioned this already, but the ideals of the American Revolution are going to affect society in America in terms of gender roles, debates about slavery, and they also, like I said earlier, inspired revolutions in France as well as in Haiti. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, well, not really the French Revolution, but we'll talk about the Haitian Revolution a little bit in our next unit. But some of the ideas, and we didn't really talk a lot about these in class, but there's one big idea that you absolutely have to know about. You should have read about it, so you should be familiar with it, but that's the idea of Republican motherhood. The founders of the Constitution, the men who drafted these constitutions, I think one of their biggest concerns was the education of the population. And so public education is going to become very important in our societies going forward from the Constitutional Convention. But in the meantime, we realize that the one true way to educate our young, especially young men, is going to be through the home, through their mothers. And we look to the mothers of America to essentially start influencing the political operations of our country by teaching their son and raising their sons under the idea of republicanism and the principles of liberty. So it was kind of thrust upon the women that they're going to teach their sons about the role the role they play in a political society. And that's why education is going to become important. And women need to be educated in order to become part of the Republican motherhood. So yes, the boys are being geared towards being good citizens in the Republic, but the girls are being educated so they can raise more good men in this Republican society. So that was, the value of what was going on here. So we're going to see the role of women start to change in society. We already kind of talked about the debates about slavery, and then we talked about how they inspired revolutions. But I definitely wanted to touch in on that idea of Republican motherhood. And you're going to see women rise up during this time who have a voice that who influence, especially their husbands. I think Abigail Adams is probably the most famous woman during this time period with regards to the influence of women in society. She and her husband, John Adams, exchanged letters all the time. She influenced, said, don't forget, I mean, her famous statement is, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence, don't forget the ladies. And I know there's a whole lot that goes to that, but when she said that, she was hoping that the men, as they were drafting this government, would consider the value that women had. Now, I'm sure she wanted political rights for women, but that's not going to happen for some time. I'm just going to tell you. But that's okay. We can still teach about it. We're still teaching about it. All right, so let's go to big idea number 9. The presidencies of George Washington and John Adams set the precedents for the way America would behave regarding the relationship between the federal government and the state governments, the economic policy of our country, as well as the foreign policy. Now listen, during the constitutional debate, as the Constitution was being drafted, we saw two groups rise up. You had the Federalists and you had the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were people who supported a strong central government. These were people who lived in urban areas. They were manufacturers. They worked in trade and all that other stuff. You had the Anti-Federalists who they wanted the states to maintain more power. And most of those folks lived in the rural areas. Now, Federalists and Anti-Federalists were not essentially political parties during the Constitutional Convention, but some of their ideas are going to grow into what will become the platforms of the first political parties. Washington's going to come into office, and he's going to essentially establish what the executive department is going to look like. He's going to establish the very first cabinet that had the departments of state, treasury, and war. He is going to start implementing the tenets of the Constitution within government. And, and the very first thing he has to deal with is the debt. America still has a lot of debt. I mean, we can create this great Constitution, we can create this great government, but this Constitution has not written a single check towards our debt yet. And so he's going to look to the very first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, to fix the debt problem for our country. Excuse me just a second. All right, here we go. Alexander Hamilton is going to have a 3-pronged approach to fixing our national debt. The very first thing he wants to do is he wants to assume all the state debt. Essentially, all the money that the states own, he wants to put it under the federal authority, and then the states will just make payments to the federal government, and the federal government will pay off all those debts to whoever it's owed to. The point of that is to establish credit. Because if we can establish credit as a country, that allows us to go and borrow more money. Because if you show that you can pay off money, people are willing to loan you money. Stay away from credit. It doesn't work for countries. It doesn't work for people. Just pay cash for everything. Even Washington would agree with me. But anyway, so assume the state debts. Second thing, we need a bank. He wants to start the Bank of the United States, and this bank is going to have several purposes. Number one, it's going to be a storehouse for the funds that are coming in. It's also going to provide loans for businesses so we can start building up the businesses and the economy of America, and then we can draw interest from those loans. So the Bank of the United States is going to be a very key component of his financial plan. And then the final component was taxation. He wanted to use an excise tax, which was a tax on whiskey at this point, and he also wanted to start implementing tariffs on all imports coming into our country. So essentially, assume state debts, set up a national bank, and taxation, excise taxes and tariffs. That's the plan. And things looked okay for the most part, but the former Anti-Federalists, people like Thomas Jefferson, are going to rise up against the idea of the national bank because they said there's nothing in the Constitution about this bank. And even James Madison, who the father of the Constitution, who would be considered a Federalist during the constitutional debate, is going to come to the other side now and say, yeah, I didn't put anything in that Constitution about a bank, so you can't do that. Hamilton is going to argue you absolutely did have something in the Constitution. It's called the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. It's that line you wrote at the very end of Article 1, Section 8 that says that Congress has the authority to do whatever is necessary and proper for the good of the United States. And my bank is good for the United States, so it's in there. And what we have here is we have an argument over how do we interpret the Constitution. Madison and Jefferson are saying, no, you interpret it based on what's written. It's a strict construction. Whatever it says, that's what it means. Hamilton, Adams, and honestly to a point Washington said, no, we need to take a more loose approach to how we interpret it, have a loose construction of the Constitution, because there is no way this Constitution could address every single need that this country is going to have in the future. That's why you put the necessary and proper clause in there. It's not about what's in black and white. It's also about the intent of what we wrote in there. What do we intended to do as we move forward as a nation? So this debate is going to go on. Eventually, there's going to be a compromise to get Jefferson and his followers behind Hamilton and this financial plan. What Jefferson gets, quite honestly, he'll back Hamilton's financial plan, which will allow it to pass through Congress. In exchange, Congress is going to move the U.S. capital to the South. And Washington is going to donate a whole bunch of land from his land holdings. And that land sat right between Maryland and Virginia. And that's why Washington, D.C. sits there today. It's because of this debate over the interpretation of the Constitution. So now the financial plan is in play. And some people are kind of upset about the whiskey tax because Americans, we just don't like taxes. And so some farmers in western Pennsylvania are going to rise up against the whiskey tax, and they're going to lead what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details about it. Let's just say that they were doing the exact same things that they saw happen with the Shays Rebellion and with the rebellion of the Sons of Liberty against taxation during the 1760s. What's going to happen is Washington is going to use his power as the executive authority. He's going to raise an army, and he's going to take that army of approximately 15,000 soldiers into the western part of Pennsylvania and put the rebellion down. Well, you're in a group of about 300 or 400 farmers and you see 15,000 troops coming your way, you go home. So it was kind of the rebellion that never was. But what it showed us was the Constitution worked, that the federal government was strong enough to enforce the laws that had been set forth by the Constitution, and that was a good thing. We're not going to see another rebellion in our country after that. The Whiskey Rebellion was the last one, so this was good. Now Washington has to deal with other issues. He's dealt with, the debate of how to read the Constitution. He's dealt with, how the federal government, how the state government is going to get along. He's dealt with rebellions and all this other stuff. Now he's got to start dealing with foreign countries. And I mentioned to you that the French Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution. French Revolution started at about the same time that Washington took office. And of course, they want America to help because they helped us. And, and so now they want us to get involved in their war. But Washington's like, no way. We don't have the money. We have enough debt. I'm not sending soldiers because we can't afford another war. So he is going to issue what's known as the Neutrality Proclamation. And essentially the Neutrality Proclamation said, we out. We're not fighting. We're not going to get involved. We're staying out of your drama. And our stance on neutrality is going to become the norm of our foreign policy for the next 125 years. So this precedent was long lasting, obviously. A lot of people aren't happy about this. Jefferson's not happy about it. He's going to quit as Secretary of State. As a result of all this, you are going to start seeing more of a division in the politics of America. You're going to see new political parties start to come forth. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, similar to your Federalists in the constitutional debate, but more focused in on the running of the country now. So they believe in a strong government. They believe in the economy that Hamilton set up. They believe that most of their people live in urban areas. And on the other side, you have Jefferson and James Madison now, who have started the Democratic Republicans, who want more power to the states, who want to build our country on agrarian philosophy, on agriculture. And so most of their followers are there in the rural areas of our country. But so that's kind of what's going on in our country. The Neutrality Proclamation gets put out there, and Jefferson's not happy. Jefferson quits. He quits as Secretary of State because he believed that America should help the French. And the Federalists just didn't see it that way. And so he leaves office. Now, things are going to start heating up with France, and honestly with England as well, because the French Revolution starts to spread. Because the monarchies of the Europe are not liking the fact that the people are rising up against the monarchy in France. So you're going to see the other monarchies kind of start to come together and fight against France. And now all of a sudden we have another war between France and England. And we've already told France, no, we're not going to fight with you. And now we're telling England, no, we're not going to fight with you. And neither one of them are happy. And what we're going to start seeing is France is going to start seizing our American ships. And that's going to lead us into Adams' presidency. Before I forget, I skipped over this completely. Washington serves 2 terms. He's going to set that precedent. And before he leaves, he is going to give his farewell address. His farewell address is going to have some key components. Specifically, he said avoid political parties because they're going to divide our country. Yeah, go figure. He also said stay out of debt because that's going to drive our country to ruin. And go figure. And he's going to say stay out of drama. Don't build any foreign alliances because that's just going to lead to more problems. Well, we went 0 for 3. I think we lived up to his ideals for about a month. And then Adams took office. Adams is going to have to deal with the England and the English and the French at war. The French are seizing our ships. The English are boarding our ships and impressing our sailors, meaning they're kidnapping our sailors. The last thing he wants is war. He does want to maintain neutrality. So he's going to send delegates over to France to try to negotiate a peace. And when they get over there, they're going to run into some French dignitaries who say, oh, Monsieur, we're going to let you see our French foreign minister, but first you got to pay us a tribute. You have to give us a bribe. You have to loan us money, whatever it is. And our guys said, no, that ain't going to happen. These French dignitaries became known as X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z came and wanted this money from us, and we told them no. The XYZ affair is going to lead to a quasi-war between us and France. This was a naval war that was fought, between us and France as a result of the XYZ affair. And just to be honest with you guys, both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were upset about this, and they both supported Adams in the way he handled this situation. It's called a quasi-war because war was never declared. It was an unofficial war. But make no mistake about it, we were absolutely fighting in a war during this time. So we got the quasi-war going on, and that's going to go on for about 2 years. Adams is going to be living in this state of fear. He was really afraid of dissent within our country. The one thing the Federalists feared the most was anarchy. They feared the people rising up. So Adams wanted to take some steps to prevent any dissent within the country. Now, what we might not have talked about in class, and I want to hit on here, we've got a lot of immigrants coming to our country. The numbers are growing. And we have people from Ireland or Scotland who are coming in, who they are, they're supporting the English. We do have a lot of people like Jefferson and his followers who are supporting the French. And so what Adams and Congress are going to do is to try to control all these immigrants and control all these viewpoints, and prevent some, people from, stirring up the masses. They're going to pass the Alien and the Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts basically controlled immigration, saying that you had to live here for 14 years instead of 5 to become a citizen, saying that if you were seen as a threat to peace in America, the president has the right to expel you or deport you from America. The other side of this law was the Sedition Act. So the Sedition Act basically made it illegal to say anything negative in print about the government. So they couldn't, you couldn't publish any malicious or slanderous things about our government. The argument is, well, that's unconstitutional, but the Sedition Acts in the future are going to be declared constitutional during times of war. I don't think John Adams knew that was going to happen, but he did have this in play. It had an expiration date of March 1st, 1801, which just happened to be Inauguration Day, when he was probably going to leave office. But anyway, Alien and Sedition Acts, a big deal, and they were actually the major topic of debate during the election of 1800. As a result, before the election, what you're going to see is states are going to start pushing back against the federal government and some of the laws they're passing, specifically in Virginia and Kentucky. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are going to draft what's known as the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. And these resolutions essentially said, and were passed by the state legislatures, that any law passed by the federal government that is deemed unconstitutional by the states can be nullified by the states. It's essentially saying if we don't like the law, or if the law is hurting the people in our state, that's unconstitutional, so we are not going to follow it. We're just going to strike it from our records. This is going to play a big role going forward into the 19th century. And we're going to see a number of states and a number of issues when this is going to be put into play. And it's just setting the precedent right now. All right, let's get to this last big idea number 10. Ideas about American national identity found expression in art, literature, and architecture. There was national expressions. There's this expression of identity that you saw not only in art and all these other places, but you're also going to start seeing these regional representations as well. Now, I'm not going to go too far in depth into this because this really starts to kick in during the next unit. But our national identity is going to be captured in different works of art and different types of literature. And we're absolutely going to start seeing that grow towards the end of the 18th century going into the 19th century. But we also start to establish a national identity with regards to our relationship with foreign countries. And you could almost put this in the previous big idea, but you're going to see the growth of foreign relationships during this time. Let me just go back and I'll just put this under foreign policy. It should have been there anyway. You're going to see treaties signed with the Native Americans. For instance, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act is going to be signed that regulated the relationship between Native Americans and settlers, that they make provisions and they have fair dealings. This is going to allow for, as far as the government was concerned, more westward expansion. As far as the natives concerned, they really didn't get treated fairly, so you're going to start seeing more conflicts starting to rise up again once we get into the next unit. Different treaties are going to be signed with Spain. We're going to sign Pinckney's Treaty that sets the boundary between Spanish Florida and the United States. It also gives free navigation along the Mississippi River for both countries. Jay's Treaty is going to be signed, which was supposed to pacify the English during that war, which it really didn't, because we gave England favored nation trading status, and they didn't do nothing for us. They were supposed to leave our forts on the western frontier, and they didn't. They were supposed to stop impressing our sailors on the high seas, and they didn't. I mean, they just didn't live up to anything because, well, let's be honest, they still don't respect us. It's the way it is. All right. I think that's really, we got a lot of stuff. That's about it. That's really all I got. So I think I pretty much just covered all of Unit 3. So now is the time when you start peppering me with questions. And the way you ask questions is you just throw them there in the chat. And I will be happy to answer any questions you have for the next few minutes. But, sorry, I was looking to see if I had any text messages. I don't. But what I'd like to see, I'm not going to sit here all night, but if you have any questions that I can answer about this unit, please ask them now. And we'll just go from there. Our test tomorrow, well, I've already told you enough about the test, so no questions coming in. That's probably a good thing. Maybe I just did such a good job. Oh, question. Woo. What was big idea number one? Big idea number one had to deal with the French and Indian War. So when we go back to big idea number one, I'll stick it up there for you. Let me change my screen here real quick. Go back here. Big idea number one is about the French and Indian War, how it's going to lead to this desire for American colonies. They want to expand westward due to the victory. And it's also going to lead to the taxation due to the debt from the war. That's pretty much all it said. So just realize that the French-Indian War, that's the very first event of this unit, and it propels everything. If we had never had the French-Indian War, I don't even know what would have happened, because like I said, we wanted to stay part of the English Empire all the way up until when we actually drafted the Declaration of Independence, because even when we sent out the Olive Branch Petition, that was a last-ditch effort, but it was still an effort to stay part of the empire. So, even though we had 1/3 of our population was patriots, we wanted to stay with England for the right up until the last minute. So, okay. So hopefully that helps, Alfred. Any other questions I can answer for you guys? It's always interesting to spend 3 weeks talking about this in class and then 1 hour reviewing it, just like that. So, all right. So I'm going to be honest. I don't see any questions coming in. I don't know how many of you guys are still online with me. I still got about 15 people online. So if you do have a question, throw it out there and I'll ask it. I'm not going to sit around much longer. I'm just waiting, honestly, for the lag, because there's about a 30 to 45 second lag between when I say something and when you guys actually hear it. So, nothing coming through. Nothing. All right. So I am going to slowly start to say goodnight there it is. See, as soon as I start to say goodnight, the chat comes up. Were the majority of acts and taxes passed affecting rural areas and people mainly? Honestly, Bryce, no. I think the majority of the taxes were affecting the people who lived in the urban areas, because if you think about it, like the Stamp Act was paper products. If you're a farmer out in the western part of Virginia, you're probably, you might have to go get a deed or something like that. So you might have to pay that tax, but you're pretty much living your life out there. The Townsend Acts, which was paint, lead, paper, tea, and glass. Again, that's not something, if you're not in an urban area, you're probably doing things on your own. And there's probably a lot of bartering going on the western part of the colonies as well. So I think that when we look at the acts that were passed, the ones we talked about, it had more of an effect in the urban areas like the Bostons and the New York Cities and the Philadelphias and places like that. And if you look at it, where was the hot spot in all of this? It was in Boston. Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party. And when England was fighting the war, their initial strategy was to cut off New England, because they felt if they cut off New England, all the other colonial regions would just kind of give up. So that answers your question. I hope it does. We got to look at those urban areas as the driving force. So not saying that the people in the rural areas weren't affected at times, but a lot of this is my opinion. I'm going to be honest. How does virtual representation affect the colonies? Well, Alfred, virtual representation is what Parliament told the colonies when they said they were being taxed without representation. Virtual representation, basically, Parliament said, we're thinking about you while we're making these decisions, because we promised when we took our oath of office that we would serve all citizens of the English Empire, and that includes you. So we don't excuse me. We don't just represent the people of London. We don't just represent the people in Ireland or Scotland or India. We represent everybody. And so that's what virtual representation means, is that we're representing everybody at the same time. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers was a battle between the Americans and the Native Americans. And essentially, it was just a small battle with regards to regional control and the U.S. citizens starting to encroach on Native American land. But it's going to result in another treaty and another promise to not expand beyond a certain line. It was really the first battle between the Americans, not the colonists, but between the Americans and Native Americans. So that's why it's on the review, Isaac. Thanks for asking. I don't really talk about it in class very much. It's in your reading. So some of this stuff I don't talk about in class. That's why I want you guys to read, because I just can't hit everything in class. So, okay. What else we got? Good questions there. Nothing more coming in. So it is almost 8:45. Which means it's almost my bedtime. So a couple more minutes here. I'll hang out. I'll try to get the dogs to give a review, but they're both just crashed out right here at my feet. So I don't know. They might be too tired. So, all right. I'm going to try to get the dogs up. If you have a question, there's still time to get it, but let me see what I can do. You want to get up here? You want to come say hello? Come on up. Come on. Get up here. Come here, Flynn. Flynn, let's tilt this down a little bit. Tilt this down just a bit. There we go. All right, ready? Get up here. Come here. Get up. There we go. Here comes Flynn. Here he comes. Flynn's here to wish you luck. He always has to make an appearance. Yes. I should get him his own YouTube channel. Anyway, all right. So here's Flynn wishing you luck. You can see Gilligan's down here too. Both of the boys say you guys got this exam, no problem. 22 multiple choice questions, 1 SAQ, all done during the time period. What are some of the major differences between Washington and Adams president and the methods and beliefs? Well, both of them were Federalists. They basically both had the same beliefs. Adams was Washington's vice president. So when we talk about the differences, I think the differences come from what they had to deal with as president. Washington introduced the Neutrality Proclamation, so he didn't have to get, or he didn't get involved in any of the wars in Europe whatsoever. Adams actually did get involved, not that he wanted to, because of the fact that our ships were being boarded and our ships were being stolen by the French and our sailors were being impressed, and that's why the whole XYZ affair happened. So when you talk about the differences, their beliefs were the same. They were both Federalists, even though Washington never claimed the Federalist moniker as his political party. He was a Federalist. So and I guess the other thing too is Washington had more leadership ability. Adams was a very smart man. Washington had more leadership experience. So, but like I said, Adams was there throughout Washington's presidency, although he didn't really do much as the vice president, but he saw how Washington operated and he carried on a lot of the same precedents. He kept the same ideas and stuff like that. So as far as political differences, none whatsoever. So, okay. All right. That question came in under the wire, but that's okay. All right, so dogs have made their appearance. I've answered a few questions. We've gone through 10 big ideas, all the way from the French Indian War to the Revolution to the Constitution to the United States of America. So you guys are going to be ready to go tomorrow. I am ready to go tonight, so I am going to not bid you farewell. Alistair comes in with a question at the end. Good question. On the review today for question 6, what was the association the First Continental Congress created for boycotting? This was the Continental, This was the Continental Association, Alistair. And essentially this was an organization that was kind of similar to like the Committees of Correspondence or, other committees that were created during this time. And it was created just to organize the boycotts throughout the colonies. It wasn't, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to get the timeline in my head. They had the non-importation and the non-consumption agreements, And I think those came out of, that was after the Townsend Act. So yeah, those came out after the First Continental Congress came together. So they created this association that oversaw all of that made these calls for non-importation, made these calls for non-consumption, and stuff like that. So it was just a fancy name to get them all together. The outcome of the Alfred, I went through that. The outcome of the Great Compromise was that it created a two-house bicameral legislature based on representation on population as well as equal representation in the Senate. If you weren't here when I went through that, you can watch the replay, and I talk about the whole thing right there. So, it basically, the Great Compromise created our government. It was, it put it all together, gave it structure. So, okay. Anything else? I would start saying goodnight again, but then another question would pop up. Maybe I should just turn it off and leave, but I won't do that. All right, let me see. Let me look at my screen and see what you're hearing right now. Yep, okay. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm going to call it a night. I want to thank you guys for watching, and go ahead, do a little studying tonight, get a good night's sleep. I will see you tomorrow, whether it's in the morning or the afternoon, and I'll be excited because it's going to be a test day. So I'm going to bid you good night, and we will see you tomorrow. Again, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.